friends, it's Lexa, and today we are going to rank all of the books that I have read so far in 2023 from worst to best. A couple of things to know. I'm gonna try to go quickly because sometimes I can get caught up talking about one book for minutes and minutes and minutes, and I don't want us to be here for like 1,000 hours. Second thing, this could change at any given time. Even as I was going through this list, I was like, okay, sometimes like I could change things around a little bit and I would still feel good about it. This is how I am feeling about these books today, which also brings us kind of like to point 2A, 2.0, 2.1. I definitely suffer from, I don't know what you would call it, where if I like a book in the moment, like right after I'm done reading it, I'm like 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars. Very rarely in the moment, unless I really make myself sit back and say, okay, Lexa, was this really 5 stars or did you just really like it and maybe it's like a 4, a high 4? Very rarely do I give a book 4 stars in the moment, unless I make myself sit back and think about it. Everything is subjective, reading is subjective, which brings us to our next point, point number 3. If I loved something that you hated, or if I hated something that you loved, that's fantastic. As someone who like tends to, especially when it comes to like horror books, like things that a lot of people don't end up liking, I love that. Like, I am so here for the fact that you have your own reading taste, I have my own reading taste, and this is not to say that any of these books are objectively bad, because reading is completely subjective, right? What I think is a fantastic, absolutely everyone should read book might be something that you're like, oh my god, I hated that book. We have 54 books on this list. I did leave out all of my rereads. There was only a few. I reread The Cabin at the End of the World, 5 star, that's an all-time favorite. Wouldn't even be fair. And I also read the entire Wayward children's series. I didn't put that on this list because like those are rereads and those hit differently. And those are also some of my all-time favorite books. These are just books that I read for the first time in 2023. If you enjoy videos like this, hit that subscribe button, turn that bell notification on, give this video a big or a small thumbs up, and let's go ahead and get into ranking all of the books that I've read so far this year. Starting off, we have The Girl in the Video by Michael David Wilson. And this was my fault, okay? I did a vlog where I read horror novellas in a cabin while I was alone, and I picked this up randomly at the library because I was looking for some novellas. This one looked interesting. It pitched itself as like a horror or thriller book for the iPhone generation, and I was like, that's me. I'm in. This was absolutely awful. I think that this guy runs a podcast. I'm pretty sure that this was just a cash grab. It literally felt like reading one of those things that like your great aunt would share on Facebook that's like, oh my god, look at this scary story, this is so crazy. There was no point. The twists were unsavory and there were definitely some questionable things. Absolutely not. Next, this is such an unpopular opinion, and if you love this book, you are in the majority, okay, so don't take what I say to heart, please. The Priory of the Orange Tree. Samantha Shannon, girl, you pitched this book to me as sapphic, magical, epic fantasy, dragons. What? Not enough dragons. Absolutely did not care about either one of the sapphic love interest, either one of those characters. No. I spent 750 pages reading a book for that ending, and there was like almost no magic. With that being said, I definitely would still consider reading the prequel to this because I actually think that's the story she wanted to tell. And I've heard really good things about that, but everyone loves this book, okay? So it's me, okay? Maybe my expectations were just too high, I don't know, but I felt bamboozled. Next one is also a very unpopular opinion. The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. I wanted to love this book, okay? I think that I ended up losing the footage of me reading this, and I wish that I hadn't, because when I tell you, I tried so hard to love this book. I ended up buying the e-reader copy because the physical copy, it was like hurting my hands to read. Shout out to everyone in the UK who reads those UK paperbacks, because I don't know how you do it without like breaking the spine all of the time, because my wrist hurt, my arthritis could never, okay? I ended up buying the e-reader copy, highlighting, taking notes, going back and forth, trying to figure out what was going on. I was on board, okay, kind of. I was like, if all of this is worth it, if this comes around to fruition for it to be like worth all of this stress and ramblings that we have gone on, I'm down. Nothing happened in this book, okay? And I am someone who loves when nothing happens in books. But there was no point. I felt like I didn't get a chance to connect to the characters, and I am definitely a character-driven reader. So for all of this time that we spent on just like floofy, fluffy writing, I didn't feel like I knew any of the characters or their motivations. And I had no idea what was going on the entire time. Oh my god, the next one is also an unpopular opinion. This was the first book that I read this year. And I went in with the highest of hopes for Kissed Her Once for Me by Alison Cochrane. Like, I didn't believe in the love story. And I feel like that was because the setup of this, oh yeah, I haven't talked about what these books are about. That's not what we're here for, right? This was like on people's favorite of the year, and it is a sapphic holiday rom-com. And that's what I was like, count me in. I'm not normally a holiday rom-com kind of girly, but I love queer love stories. And I thought if this was going to be the thing that worked for me with romance, the only romance up until that point that I had rated 5 stars was Delilah Green Doesn't Care. So I was like, this is gonna be perfect. This is gonna be amazing. People are loving this. I don't get it. This premise of this is like fake dating, fake engagement, but she's fake engaged to the love interest's brother. And we get flashbacks to like when they met, and there is this part in there that we're supposed, like she is a webcomic designer, but we never see the webcomics. She just like types out the words of it. If you're going to have a webcomic designer and like you're gonna be showing us the webcomics, show us a webcomic. It didn't work for me. The ending didn't work for me. I never felt like the character, I never got to see them actually interacting in positive ways and like actually being in love. And I don't know if that's like what romance is supposed to be about, but I don't like that. I don't want 3 pages of an ending where they're like, oh, everything's fine now, we're in love, where the rest of the time they just spent arguing and fighting with each other. No, thank you. The next one is Forged in Fire and Stars. I read this because I pulled it as a prompt for Bookish Bumble. I actually bought this from the dollar store back when I like first started reading, and I was just excited at the idea that the dollar store had books, and this looked like a fantasy book, and I was like, oh my god, this is amazing, it's $1. It was a quest traveling story, which usually doesn't work for me. Could I even tell you what the plot of this book was? No. Like, it was so forgettable, and it was so slow paced, but not in a way, like I love a good slow paced book if I'm learning more about the characters, or I'm getting beautiful writing, or we're setting something up. No, this was just like a really long prologue. Like, I don't know what happened in this, but it did not work. It was the start of a YA fantasy series. I will not be continuing. I already forgot literally everyone's names, which is not uncommon for me, but I also forgot the entire plot, which is pretty uncommon for me. Next, we're getting into the set of books that I would say I disliked, but I didn't hate. Yeah, that feels right. And that is, I have to say this slowly, The Book of the Most Precious Substance. My mouth does not want to say that title quickly at all. This is classified as horror, but I don't know if I would quite pitch it that way. The premise of this sounds really cool. Our main character is trying to find this book called The Book of the Most Precious Substance, and it's like a dark occult book that's supposed to give you like everything that you could possibly ever want. And she is like a book dealer, and she has to go on this like adventure to go try to find this book. And I loved Sarah Grant's other book, Come Closer, which is like a horror novella. And I truly thought that I would love this book and it would fall into the weird horror that I'm into. Oliver also has some grievances that he would like to tell us all about. I didn't feel any strong feelings about the characters. I didn't even passionately dislike any of them. It was just kind of like, whatever. So then when the ending came around, I was just like, I don't care. Next is Malice by Heather Walter. I wanted to love this book. The TikTok girlies, you did me dirty on this one, okay? This was pitched as like an amazing sapphic fantasy romance. And I was trying to explore fantasy romance, what works for me, what doesn't in this vlog. And I thought, okay, since sapphic romance is the only one that's worked for me in the past, let's try to incorporate that into our fantasy romance. I think that I discovered with this book that I'm just not a huge fan of retellings. This is a Sleeping Beauty retelling, but from the perspective of the evil queen. Is she an evil queen? I think so. And that sounded like right up my alley. But a lot of this was world building that, again, kind of like the Priory of the Orange Tree, I felt like the author wanted to write what would be the prequel of this story, but then ended up writing this one instead to make it like a retelling. Because we talked more about what had already happened, and we got told a lot of information and a lot of info dumping, and then we like never saw, very rarely saw the two like love interests interact. So by the time, again, that the ending came around, I was just like, I don't care. I wanted to care so badly. Thank God I had the audiobook, or I probably would have DNF'd it. The next one on the list, I almost considered just not even putting on here because at the time when I read it, I didn't even rate it. So I want to preface this by saying, I read this book for a book club because I love the book club. This book was not for me. I would have DNF'd it if it hadn't been for the book club, and then therefore my rating literally does not matter. But since it was, like, it would have been the only book that I read. There's another book on this list that I also didn't rate, but I felt like I could rank it. So don't take my word for this. Tons of people love it. If it sounds like your thing, check it out. And that is The Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon. This is a paranormal romance by Kimberly Lemming. We read it for the smutty, I think the theme was like smutty romance at my book club. If you love kind of like fanfic vibey fantasy romance novellas, check this out. I think you'll very quickly, it was a super fast read. I think you'll figure out if like her writing style vibes with you or not. Personally for me, it just didn't, but it was never going to, and that's totally okay, and I'm not the person that this was written for. It's on Kindle Unlimited, so check it out if it feels like your thing. Then we have A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. I wanted so passionately to love this. One of the first books that I read got me kind of back into reading was Neon Gods by Katie Robert, and that was a Hades and Persephone retelling. I loved that book. So this is also a Hades and Persephone retelling. I thought, this is perfect, this is gonna work for me, maybe that's my thing. There were a lot of plot holes in this. It felt a little under-edited. I didn't really believe in like the main conflict of this book, and I also just didn't buy into the love story. Also, the smutty scenes, which is like part of what I came here for, awful, awful. They were like back to back to back to back, but they were only like a page long, and they all happened right at the end of the book. It just was not for me. I think we have a series of things that just weren't for me because this next book also was not. And that is Lead Me Astray by Sodney Warner. This again has that kind of fanficky paranormal romance vibe. It's queer, it's polyamorous, there are tons of different types of paranormal creatures in here, and it's urban fantasy. This was originally like a Wattpad series, and then they made it into a book. I think as a Wattpad series, that's how like it would be best consumed. For me, it was just too long. I was into that vibe for like a day, but it took me more than a day to read this book. So after that, I was just a little bit bored. It wasn't insta-lovey, but it felt insta-lovey because there were whole like months that we would skip where like we would have been building up the tension and love, the fondness, the attraction between the three characters that we completely missed. So I felt like I was missing it. Then we have As Good as Dead. This is the third and final book in the Good Girls Guide to Murder trilogy. I wanted to love this. I had heard that the people who didn't like it because it went completely unhinged, which it did. There is a definite tone shift in this. We'll talk more about the other two, especially the first one, because I actually ended up fucking loving the first one. This one did not work for me, but not because it went unhinged. I was actually kind of down for the plot twist and the tone shift that we had in this book, but because I felt like the ending was rushed and it was kind of just used as like a plot device. Like she had an idea of where she wanted to go and she just made her characters get there. And it felt that way. And as a character-based reader, it just takes me out of the story when that happens. And it was such a disappointment, especially because of how much I loved that first book. And at this point, I honestly wish that I would have just read that as a standalone, but it's fine. Then we have The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. This is another book that I read for that same book club. I would have also picked this book up just to see if it was like my thing. This kind of has like slasher vibes. Oh, again, I haven't been telling you what these books are about. Well, that's not what you come here for, right? I'm terrible at synopsis, okay? And a synopsis summed up in like a sentence, most of the time not. But this title does tell you exactly what it is. It is a support group for final girls. Like the trope that was really big in the 80s and 90s where we had the slasher films and there'd be like one final girl to live and survive and she would kill her killer. Imagine those girls, but they were real and they all came together once a month for a support group. But then all of a sudden they start getting picked off one by one. This just fell flat for me. I never felt really at unease. The main character, the decisions that she made just so did not align with who she was and who we were like made to believe she was at the beginning of this book. If you like over the top want to read a book that kind of feels like a slasher film, pick this up. It may work for you, but I also know that it has lower reviews. So not hating on horror books that have lower reviews. I absolutely love horror books. Then I look on Goodreads and I'm like, wait, not everyone else did not also love this? Just saying, I think that there's a very specific type of person that this book would work for. Oh my fucking God. Now we're getting into the group of books that are like, fine, good, I liked them. Of varying degrees of fine and goodness. Starting with All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This is a horror novella about Murderbot. Don't go into it thinking that kind of vibe, okay? But the things that I liked about this was how relatable Murderbot was. Like, Murderbot just wanted to sit around and watch like Netflix instead of like actually interacting with anyone else or doing their job. And that was like relatable. But for me, maybe if I carried on this novella series, I would grow like more fond of all of the characters. But this was again kind of like a forgettable book for me, which I was not really expecting. Then we have The Paulbearers Club by Paul Tremblay. I have mixed feelings on this book. I liked it more than I expected to. I read this for reading all of Kayla's favorite books, and I was going into this thinking that this was not going to work for me at all. This is pitched as, and I think that this is the tricky part, is it's pitched as horror. It's not really. And it's pitched as a book where a guy is writing a memoir because he believes that his best friend is a vampire. But it's not. Like, it's more of a slow burn kind of slice of life friendship story. But the cool thing about this is we have the guy's memoir, So we have his memoir of him writing about his life and why he thinks his best friend is a vampire. But then we also have like the annotations from his best friend who he thinks is a vampire, who is like almost annotating and editing the rough draft of this memoir. If you like 80s references and you want a friendship story with a little bit of a hint of maybe weirdness, this might work for you, but don't go into it expecting horror book. Next is Finley Donovan Jumps the Gun by El Casamano. This is the third book in the Finley Donovan series, and it is the last one I will be reading. At the time, I rated this book 4 stars. I don't know what I was thinking. I think I just wanted to love this series, and I was excited that I liked this one more than the second one, because the second one was so bad. So bad. Finley Donovan herself is not a character that I feel like we can hold up an entire series of mystery kind of books. The first book I loved in this series, and I would just recommend reading that one. So far, the rest of the series has just been downhill for me personally. There was also some weird propaganda and like cop hero worshipping in here that I was like, this is uncomfy. It is over the top. It's supposed to be like an over the top kind of cozy mystery, but it's not cozy, okay? It's just cozier than typical mystery books that I read. But I'm done with the series. I read it for the Literally Dead Book Club. I'm out. Then we have You Truly Assume by Layla Sabrine. This is a YA contemporary following 3 different girls who are Black and Muslim after a terrorist attack in the United States. And the Islamophobia, the racism, and everything that kind of comes along with that. Their lives and both the hardships and the joys that they're experiencing. The thing that connects the 3 of them, because they actually live in different states, is this blog that one of them starts talking about their experience as a Black Muslim teen girl. This book had such a good premise, and I saw instances that I really connected with how the writer was writing, but I feel like because of the setup of having 3 different perspectives that very rarely ever interact, and when they do, it's not in person, it just felt like we were getting told a lot rather than shown. And because of that, it felt like I was reading 3 completely different stories, and I almost would have just preferred one of them, or preferred for the author to have some way for them to like come together and have more of an overlap between their stories so that we got to see like their interactions and see more of what was happening in their lives rather than being told it. But we are getting into like the 3-4 star tier, like 3.5. I would say 3, how many times am I gonna say that? So like all of these are still books that are good. The Book Eaters by Sun Yi Dean. I wanted to love this so much. This has such a cool premise. We're in our world, but it's like an alternate reality where there are humans and then there are book eaters, which are people who consume books instead of food for sustenance. But then when they eat the books, they also like gain all of the knowledge of the books. But then there's also mind eaters who have to eat the minds of people in order to survive. And our main character, she is a mom and she's a book eater, and her son is a mind eater. And this is definitely a story focused around mother, like being a mother, but then it also is kind of like weirdly a cult story, because the way that the structure of like the system, the social system of book eaters is very patriarchal cult-like. And this book just goes in a completely different direction than you would think it would go based off of how this is often pitched. And I just desperately wanted and hoped for more from this book. Then Over the Wayward Wall by A. Deborah Baker. This is a pseudonym for Shauna McGuire. This is the novella that is inside of Middle Game. Middle Game is like one of my favorite books of all time by Shauna McGuire. In that, we are learning about like it's our world, but there's also a book in this world that it references and has little snippets of, but then Shauna McGuire went on to actually write the novella, and it's a middle grade novella that is about these 2 kids, Avery and Zib, who are completely opposite. Avery is like very punctual and according to the rules and like everything has a purpose, and Zib is just like completely wildflower child, goes with the flow, is her own kind of person. They're walking to school one day, they run into this wall, they go over the wall, and there's this magical world. It is weird. It's kind of Every Heart a Doorway-esque, but I would say it's not as good as Every Heart a Doorway. I love Shauna McGuire's writing so much that that's what worked for me in here, and I really loved Zib as a character, but the plot of this was a little bit meandering. I didn't really know what the point of it was, and I think had it not been written by Shauna McGuire, this would have been such a flop, but because of her writing, it kind of worked for me. I'm gonna continue on in the series, but the next book is probably gonna decide whether I finish it out or not. A Tangle of Spells by Michelle Harrison. This is a middle grade fantasy series that is about these 3 sisters, and it's just so wholesome and whimsical, and I love the dynamics between these 3 sisters. The first book is all about like their adventures of there is this curse where they're never supposed to leave the little island that they're on, but then some things ensue and they have to, and each one of them has like their own magical item that they've been gifted, and It's the characters that really make this for me, but then each book kind of also acts as a standalone in a way of like it has its full arc, and you could read them alone, but I would recommend reading them in order because then you learn about the three sisters and their dynamics and kind of like what makes each one of them so special. I feel like Michelle Harrison really knows who her characters are, knows exactly what they would be doing at any point in time, and you can really tell that from the story. This one was probably like my least favorite of the three, but I only have one more in the series and I'm gonna continue on, and I still love it, and I think it's one of my favorite middle grade series. Death in Her Hands by Otessa Moshfegh. This is the other book that I didn't rate and I still haven't rated, and I still don't know how I feel about it because parts of this book were a serious 1-star for me and then parts of it was a 5-star, but averaging that out to like a 3 doesn't feel correct, but I still have it in here because I still think about this book a lot, and I said it at the time that I read it that I felt like this was gonna be a book I thought about. The premise of this is that this old woman is like walking in the woods behind her house. She finds this note that says like, here lies someone, can't remember her name, she's dead, or I didn't kill her, or something like that. And it's really her just making up what happened to this woman. She doesn't actually find a body, she just finds this note. So it's really her kind of slowly becoming more unhinged as she is making up who this woman could have been, what could have happened to her, all of this. It's really a look into her unraveling. There was some serious fat phobia in here that I get made sense for our character, but it just took me out of the story so much because it was just so gross. I wouldn't say I enjoyed this. Do I think that it did what it set out to do? Yes, but would I recommend this as like an enjoyable experience for most people? No. And I think it's marketed as horror, but it's not really, but kind of, but not horror in the way that most people would expect from that. But I still think about it a lot. Okay, so that's a testament to it. Then we have Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Khaw. I read this again in that reading horror novellas in a cabin, and I ended up liking this more than I thought I would considering how low of ratings it has on Goodreads. I think this was like one of the lowest average rated books that I had on my Goodreads shelf. I had heard about this a lot on BookTube because I feel like it's a horror novella people talk about and then they all end up not liking it. It's sometimes pitched as like a haunted house vibe. I couldn't even really tell you what the plot of this book is. This group of friends goes to this house that is supposed to be haunted. I think 2 of them are getting married in that house, or it's like their honeymoon or something. But then I don't really know what happened. I just know it kind of worked for me. And I think the reason that I rated this like as high as I did is because I was unsettled. Like there were times that I was like, what the fuck is happening? I know that Cassandra Khaw is coming out with another novella, I believe this year, and I still want to read that because I do think that Cassandra Khaw's writing could work for me. And this was like a 3.5, so it was still pretty solid. Ooh, this is an unpopular opinion, even though it's still a 3-star. Yes, I did have a book that is 3.5 below a book that I gave a 3. I don't want to talk about it, okay? And that is Notes on an Execution by Dania Kakafka. I wanted this book to be a 5-star, and I thought that it was going to be, should say, this is very highly rated. I still very much recommend it. This is a book following a serial killer who is on death row, and we're following his perspective and the perspective of 3 women who have been in his lives and whose lives he has impacted and whose lives they have impacted his life. This is not, like, it sometimes pitches a thriller. It's more literary fiction. There are some thrilling elements to it, but that's not the point. This is a look on the criminal justice system and the death penalty, but it's done through a very white lens that left me feeling like a little uncomfortable, especially since the author made a couple literal throwaway sentence comments about how Black women go missing and often they are not cared about as much as like when white women go missing, and how Black men are very much overrepresented in our criminal justice system and on death row. But because they were literally just like a sentence or 2 thrown in there, and then we never talked about it again, and we have the perspective of a cop and we never talked about the implications of that, it didn't hit as hard for me as I thought that it was going to, but I still feel like this would be, like, I could recommend this to so many people. And if that sounds like something you want to read it. I just think this should not be where you stop on the journey of having conversations and learning about and talking about the criminal justice system in the United States. Because we cannot have those conversations without centering Black people, Black women, and Black men who are disproportionately affected by the system. Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lynn Tan. This is a YA fantasy series that I would recommend for younger readers who normally reads like YA fantasy and is wanting to kind of transition into adult fantasy, but needs something kind of in the middle. I do feel like this is kind of in the middle of YA fantasy and adult fantasy because it is more epic. It's part of a duology too, so you're not committing to like a long-term commitment. And it is a beautiful story about daughter of the moon goddess who has to go on this journey to save herself and her mom, and who has to leave her home that she's never left before to go live in the kingdom and in this palace of this king who has really done her and her mom dirty. And just her commitment to her family and the love that they have and her bravery, it was beautiful. There were some things about this that didn't work for me. I felt like it was very plot heavy, which makes sense for like a YA fantasy. But because of that, the action scenes that we had, I felt like passed by so quickly I didn't really get to feel the implications of them. There's also a love triangle in here, and love triangles just don't work for me. Okay. We're like almost halfway through. Then we have The Only Black Girls in Town by Brandy Colbert. This is a YA middle grade. I love this book. This was such a good YA middle grade. I listened to the audiobook of this while I was putting together my bed frame. It was great. It's about these two girls. One of the girls has lived in her town for a long time, and she's been the only black girl who has gone to her school, lived in her neighborhood. And then a new family moves in right across the street into like the, what are those called? Bed and breakfast. They move into the bed and breakfast across the street, and it is a black family, and they have a daughter who is our main girl's age. So they become friends. It's about their friendship story. But then there's also like this little twist of they find these letters in the attic, and we get to follow that and like what they're learning about who wrote those letters. So there's a little bit of a mystery thrown in there as well. This was good. It was wholesome. Such a great middle grade. Next is a pretty recent read, which is The Spite House by Johnny Compton. I don't know why I forgot about that. I just looked. I was loving this for, like, this was exactly what I was looking for in like a ghosty haunted house kind of story. It's following this dad and his two daughters as they are trying to clearly escape something that happened in their past. And as they're on the run from that and they're trying to make ends meet, he finds a newspaper article advertising this job to live in this house and investigate the paranormal dealings. And it's offering a ton of money. And it's like, why is it offering a ton of money? Clearly they have like their own secrets. Is this house haunted? We're gonna find out. And this truly felt like I was unsettled a lot of time. It has lots of different points of view, which I really loved. It's just it's written so interestingly. And I can't wait to read from Johnny Compton again because I think that I could really vibe with his writing. The only thing is that the ending felt a little bit, it just felt a little bit off to me compared to the rest of the book, which dropped my rating because I wanted it all to come to fruition. And I remember at the 84% mark, I was like, oh no, this is not going where I want it to, and it did not. But the rest of the book, I would highly recommend, and it seems like this is a book that a lot of people rate like a 3.5, 4 star. So it works for a lot of people, and if you're looking for a horror-y, ghosty, haunted house kind of time, pick this up. Good Girl, Bad Blood, second book in the Good Girls Guide to Murder series, wasn't as good as the first book, wasn't as bad as the third. That's all I gotta say. I finally read Spy Family. Listen, I still don't know if manga is for me. I ended up giving this a 4 star rather than a 5 star. I still get it. I get the hype. I get why people love it. I'm glad I started this series because I feel like it'll be good to get me through when I feel like I'm reading like some bigger books and I just need to like complete a book. That'll kind of help power me through. It's so wholesome. It is literally about a spy who has to go on a mission where he has to like have a family, but he doesn't have a family. So he ends up going to adopt this daughter, doesn't know it, but she's a telepath. And then he has to get a wife, and they don't know that the wife is an assassin and the husband is a spy, but the daughter's a telepath, so she knows. It's cute, it's fun. Highly recommend, especially if you're into manga. And it was the first manga I ever read, so I can say as a beginner, it was a good intro. It's still the only manga book I've ever read though, so I'm definitely not the authority on that. White Hot by Ilona Andrews is the second book in the Burn For Me series. We'll talk about Burn For Me here in a second. It is an urban fantasy romance that takes place in our world, but at some point in time, it's kind of like sci-fi almost. We got like the ability to get magic, and it was almost like a bio-warfare kind of invention. It's over the top. Please ignore the covers, okay? And just trust me on this, that if you're wanting kind of the vibes of a cozy mystery, but higher stakes and incorporate fantasy romance into it, I totally recommend the series. It's so much fun. Shadows of Self by Brandon Sanderson is the second book in Mistborn Era 2. So we have Mistborn, first trilogy, my favorite series of all time. Then we have Era 2, which takes place like a few hundred years after the events of Mistborn Era 1. I'm liking where Era 2 is going, but it has a totally different vibe. There are guns. This is kind of like Western-y meets fantasy. And you have to read the first trilogy to read this anyway, so there's not a lot I can say about it, but I did like it. Why do I feel like I must have missed one? Oh my god, I did. Hi, popping back in here because I was almost done with this list and I realized that I completely skipped over this one. And that is The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. We'll talk more about this because this is the third book in is it called the fifth season trilogy? Probably not. That's what I'm gonna call it for the moment. This was my least favorite out of the three, but this is still such an incredible fantasy series that I would absolutely recommend. And we'll talk about more what it's about when we talk about the first book. Which, spoiler alert, oh my fucking god. That book. A horror novella that I read and loved is Crossroads by Laurel Hightower. This hits hard. If you're a parent, this is following a mom who she goes to her son's, the site of his death and accidentally spills blood and then starts seeing the ghost of her son. It's so much about grief. I read this alongside some of those other horror novellas. This was like hard to get through, but it's so good. And if you're interested in horror novellas, I would absolutely recommend this. I cried, and I cannot imagine if you were a mom how you would be able to get through this, because this did such a good job, I feel like, of really making you feel the grief and the feelings that she was feeling in those moments. Then we have Vicious by V.E. Schwab. I liked this a lot. It's got like superhero kind of vibes. Again, we're living in our world, but our world that has some people can possibly do magic, maybe, or like have some superpowers. And it's dual timeline. I also think it's multi-point of view. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. I don't quite remember. But we're following these two best friends in the time that they were in college together when they were best friends. And then in the future when they are no longer best friends and it's like both of their mission to kill each other. And it's like, what happened between those two times? I am going to consider this a standalone in my eyes. I don't think I loved it enough to want to carry on, but I was like, it's kind of written like it could be a standalone and I'm happy with that. But I'm pretty sure it either already is a part of a series or it's about to be, or there have been talks of making it into a series, and I'm happy with it just standing on its own. Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. Oh, now we're getting into the books that I really liked / loved. This is a YA thriller. We're following our main girl, Clara. I just read this book and I already forget. But her best friend, Monday, she gets back home after she's been gone all summer at her grandma's house and she's like, where is Monday? Monday hasn't been writing me letters. Monday's at school. No one seems to care or is looking for her. Something sketch is going on here. And this is, oh my god, such a good look at friendship. The love that like these two girls have for each other, but then also what happens so often with Black girls who go missing and who cares about that, and the lack of like urgency in our system and for the people around them. Let me tell you, I was like vibing with it most of the time, but that ending, that's really what topped it off for me. Amazing. If you think you know what's going on. One for My Enemy by Olive E. Blake. I just love Olive E. Blake's writing. Trust me, we'll get to that more toward the top of this list. Okay. This is a modern day Romeo and Juliet retelling, but make it witchy in New York and a lot darker, I would say, and also pretentious as fuck, which is Olive E. Blake's specialty. This has more of a plot, I would say, than some of the other books that I've read from her. This wasn't my favorite, but I still really loved it. Then finally, we have Burn For Me by Alona Andrews. This is the first book in that fantasy romance series I was telling you about. I liked the first book more than the second, but that could be because the second book I read on audiobook and I got lost a few times. There are a lot of characters to keep up with, but this is just so much fun. If you're in a reading slump or you just need something that is like a little bit over the top but you're along for the ride, ignore the cover please and check this out. Speaking of over the top but you're along for the ride, Jamila Green Ruins Everything. This is kind of reminiscent of Finley Donovan. I think if you liked Finley Donovan, you may enjoy this, but it is satire and it is following our main girl who she just wants to get on like the New York Times bestseller list. And in order to do that, she makes a deal with God and she's like, listen God, okay, I will start being a better person if you just put my book on this bestseller list. And she's not necessarily a character I think you're supposed to like love, but I still like loved her in a weird way. But through a series of very unfortunate events, she ends up meeting Ibrahim in a local mosque when she goes to try to bargain more with God to be a better person. And he and her end up being suspected by the CIA, FBI, one of those two people, of being terrorist and like leading this terrorist organization. And she has to go on a mission to try to rescue Ibrahim. Truly, like, it's over the top, okay? But I just loved it. It was like such a fun ride. It made me laugh. It also made me cry. While we were along for this fun ride, we were also touching on so many important topics about racism and Islamophobia and how that is handled in the United States and especially in like the upper law enforcement organizations. Alloy Flaw by Brandon Sanderson is book 1 to Era 2. of Mistborn. Like we talked about, I can't really talk a lot about this book. I really loved it. I think I gave it a 5-star at the time. That might have been a little bit of an over-exaggeration. I would say it's like a 4.5. I definitely don't think that I love Era 2 as much as I loved Era 1, but that makes sense because Era 1 is still like my favorite series of all time, so it would be really, really hard to top that. I compare this to, hear me out, if you like Sam and Dean from Supernatural, and you like that vibe of they're fighting the bad guys, and there is some like high stakes, but then there's also that level of like humor and their relationship like as brothers. Our two main characters in the Alloy of Law are not brothers, but they kind of have that same vibe. I would compare Sam and Dean in that kind of supernaturally vibe to the Alloy of Law. So I do think that if you're a fan of Supernatural, you would like this, but you also have to read Mistborn Era 1, which I would recommend anyway because it's just fucking phenomenal, okay? How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu is a series of short stories that all revolve around this idea that there's a plague that ends up breaking out because we uncover some like ancient remains, and inside of there is like a bacteria or a sickness or something that none of us nowadays have any immunity toward, and it like wipes out the population of the planet. But each story is following a different point in that timeline and different people, but they're all in interesting ways connected. What I feel like a lot of people talk about and love a lot is the story where in this time there is this roller coaster and this amusement park that you can take your kids to where if they're sick, they can have this just amazing fun day filled with laughs and everyone makes it a good time, and then you put them on this roller coaster, and on the roller coaster, because of the way it's set up, they end up like passing away in their sleep. So they get to have a good memory and then end their life without pain. It just hits so hard. This is just done phenomenally well. I think I only rated it like a 4-star at the time, but I would put this higher up because I think about this a lot. And I think if you like The Sea of Tranquility, you could really love this. I'm typically not a short story kind of person, but they all relate and interconnect, and they're all around this one theme that it felt like an actual like beginning to end kind of story for me, despite the fact that it's not. Oh my God, my camera is dying. I'm talking too long. I believe we're into the top 15 now. And this is what I would classify as 5 stars, loved, and then we'll get into what I would consider my favorites of the year so far. Google tells me this man's name is Adam Cesare. That's not how I pronounced it in my head. I really hope that that's correct. Clown in a Cornfield. This was such an unexpected 5-star. It is campy, it is slasher. It feels like you are watching a terrible 90s slasher film, but in the best way possible. It also has some interesting social commentary that I was not expecting. It's slower in the beginning because, again, kind of like the movies, we're setting up this pace, small town vibe, girl moves to the small town with her dad. There's some weird things, maybe like the way that everyone is acting in the town is a little bit strange, but okay. And then it like goes unhinged. I just had a fucking blast with this book. Oh my God, it was so much fun. And it's a YA horror, loved it. Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. This is the prequel to The Hate U Give. The Hate U Give was one of my favorite books. Although I did end up watching a video from Jessie on YouTube, and they were talking about just some things to be aware of around The Hate U Give. And now like looking back on it after a few years and like how it's aged and how a lot of times in order to get white people to like give a single shit about Black people and their stories, it usually comes from a place of Black trauma and our need to feel like Black people need to be like the good Black people in order for us to care about them and what happens to them. I love Jessie on YouTube. They create amazing, fantastic content. Definitely check them out. And I will do my best to find the video where they were talking about that and link it down below. But Concrete Rose follows the dad of our main character in The Hate U Give and his story as a teenager finding out that he's a father and him trying to navigate that. I loved it. I love Angie Thomas's writing. I think it did a fantastic job. It's super recommendable. I didn't think that I would love this as much as I loved The Hate U Give, but I really, really did. Wicked Beauty by Katie Robert. Remember when I talked about Neon Gods? This is part of that series. Katie Robert, the way that she writes love interest, the way that she writes her smut, it just works for me. I really love it. I don't know why. I don't know why her romance works for me and some others don't. I just vibe with it. This is a retelling of Helen of Troy, Achilles, and Patroclus. It's polyamorous, it's queer, we love to see it. Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. People talk about this all the time. You don't need my endorsement. It's absolutely fucking phenomenal. And the audiobook of this, that's how I consumed it. Highly recommend. Fantastic. This is a story about a woman who is in her 20s and she's living in the 1970s in New York? Don't quote me on that. We also have a time travel element in here because she will get randomly, without her much of a heads up, transported back to the 1800s in the antebellum South, where the first time that she goes, she ends up saving the life of this young boy, and she quickly finds out that they're connected and that he is set to become the owner of this plantation. And the implications of that, as she is a Black woman and her fate is now tied to this white boy's life. This is definitely on my list of like most recommendable books that I've ever read. This next one's a little weird. Definitely not on my list of most recommendable books. You Should Have Left. It's a novella about, kind of about, a man and his wife and child who go to stay at this Airbnb in Germany, and then he starts discovering some weird things about the house. The people in the town are acting very strange about them staying there. I understand why people don't love this because it's very disjointed, because you're reading the novella as if you're writing his journal. And he's simultaneously writing about his life, his marriage problems, the script for this comedy that he's writing, and the weird shit he's discovering about the house. So it will start talking about like him writing out ideas for this comedy script, and it will stop in the middle of a sentence, and then it's like the next day, because it's like he stopped writing and the next day came back for an update. I've been talking for so long, I have worn my lipstick off. Cool. Remember when I sat down to film some short videos today before I left for Florida? And I've been filming for an hour and a half. I would not recommend this to a lot of people, but I loved how I felt like we got to feel like the chaoticness that he was feeling through that kind of writing style. Final Girls by Mira Grant is also a horror novella. It's a little bit sci-fi too. Mira Grant is Shauna McGuire. And as we all know, I just fucking love anything that Shauna McGuire writes ever, okay? And this is no exception. I loved it. It's such an interesting premise because it's set in the like near future where we have this technology where people can kind of overcome their trauma or reconnect with people by going through, like experiencing traumatic events together under simulation. And obviously there's a lot of controversy surrounding that. So we follow our main character as she's going to investigate this therapy technology thing. And we have finally made it to A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. This blew me out of the water. While I would not recommend reading the whole series, but then again I would because people really love the entire series, it just didn't work for me. I was shocked that I loved this first book as much as— Oliver, just relax, just lay down, just take a nap. Your sister is right here, she's taking a nap, we're so close, okay? We're in the top 10. I was so shocked by how much I loved this book. YA mysteries have not always worked out for me in the past. This one not only surprised me, but I was entertained. I was along for the ride. The audiobook of this, chef's kiss, incredible. 12 out of 10, would recommend. It's multimedia, so there's like these what is the word I'm looking for? It sounds like you're listening to a recording of an interview. And it's a fun time, it keeps you engaged, it keeps you guessing, and there are stakes. We're following Pip. I made a character map and I still will probably get this wrong. Pip is our main character. For her senior project, she is re-exploring this case that has happened in her local town where a girl who was a few years older than her, Andy Bell, went missing and then was presumably killed by her boyfriend, who then allegedly unalived himself. But Pip doesn't believe, okay? Is this fully believable? No. But like, what mystery thriller book is, okay? You've got to suspend a little bit of disbelief, and I was here for it. All My Rage by Sabaa Tahir would also go on my list of most recommendable books I've ever read. I laughed, I cried, I wanted to just hold these characters and tell them that everything was gonna be okay. This follows 3 different perspectives, Salahuddin and Youre and Salahuddin's mom. They talk about their experience as immigrants into the United States. We get to see how his mom came over here from Pakistan and now they own this motel and what is happening there. And clearly, like, Youre and Salahuddin, they've been friends for forever, but they had a falling out. And we get to explore like kind of what happened there. It talks about anger and grief and love in all types of forms and just so many incredible topics done so flawlessly. I cannot wait to read Sabaa Tahir's fantasy series. I'm so glad that I read this. Highly recommend. I recently read Watch Over Me by Nina LaCour, and this was not the book I was expecting it to be. For some reason, I thought that it was a horror book. It's not. It's literary and it explores grief and PTSD and childhood trauma and healing from that together, like as a community. And our main character, whose name already escapes me, she's finally aged out of the foster system. We can tell that something happened in her past that she feels like really bad about and she has a lot of trauma around. And she agrees to go live kind of on this like farm thing with this family who has raised like over 40 foster kids and taken them in. But they also take in foster kids, but then they also take in kids who have aged out of the foster system, and they come in as like interns to help teach the kids and help on the farm and stuff. This was just beautiful. I sobbed my eyes out. Oh my God. It was so unexpected. It's such a quick read. I read this in like an afternoon, evening, plus the cover of this, come on, absolutely fucking stunning. This is gonna be the last one we talk about before we get into my favorites of the year, and that is The Obelisk Gate by N.K. Jemisin. This is the second book in what I am referring to as the 5th season trilogy, although I know it has a different name and I can't remember what that is at this moment. I loved this book so much, and in some ways I loved it more than the first, but the first just hit differently. And again, we'll talk about what this is about and why I loved it so much when we get to the first book. Okay, just wait, I promise it's worth it. We finally made it, okay? I've been sitting here filming for a long time. Editing Lexa is not gonna be happy with me at all, but it's fine, because I can't wait to talk to you about these books. Number 6, my 6th favorite book of the year so far. I just read recently, and that is Leave the World Behind. Oh my God. I was expecting to DNF this book. I didn't think I would like it at all. I only read it for Lalathon, for reading one of Kayla's favorite books, because I've read so many of Kayla's favorite books that I wanted to read a book that I specifically only picked up because Kayla has recommended it, that I would not have picked up otherwise. And the only reason I thought, okay, maybe, because I always swore that this would just be a book that I assumed it was never going to work for me, it was going to work for Kayla, but where our tastes differed, I figured it was this book. I am so glad that I tried it out because I could not have been more wrong. I watched a video clip where she was comparing this to Catherine House and The Cabin at the End of the World, which are 2 of my favorite books. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't know. I had no idea I was judging this book. I'm so sorry. Would I recommend this book? Nope. Only to a very specific audience, and I don't know who that audience is. I said before in one of my videos that if you liked The Cabin at the End of the World, but you're okay with a slower burn where not as much happens, and it's more literary, and you could and did vibe with the weird sexual nature that comes along with Bunny by Mona Awad. If you can appreciate all of those elements, then maybe you will like Leave the World Behind. This is a book following a family that goes to stay at an Airbnb. The owners of said Airbnb come knocking on the door saying, hey, there's a blackout, something is happening at the world, we need to stay here. Is the world ending? We don't know. Do we get to see the end of the world? Nope. We are mainly just staying in this Airbnb with these 2 families, looking at their dynamics with a little bit of a hint, some hints to what's going on outside, but not really. It was weird, and I just loved it so much. The ending made me want to throw the book across the room, which is exactly what I did with Cabin at the End of the World, which is exactly why I love that book so much. I'm so glad that I read this. Then I also read this book right alongside Leave the World Behind. This is the book that I got because I thought I wouldn't like Leave the World Behind. And that is The Wicker King by Kay Agram. Can I tell you what the story is about? Kind of, but not really. We have our main character. This is a YA kind of thriller, kind of friendship story. There's tons of different multimedia aspects of this, which I love. So this is like, it's so easy to get through this book. You can fly through this book. It's not even really done in chapters. A lot of the pages are only like half filled, or they're like a page and a half long before it flips to the next thing. But it's telling the story of 2 teenage boys who pretty much have kind of raised and supported each other their entire lives. They've got some really dysfunctional family dynamics, they've got a lot of trauma, and they are just trying to navigate the world and survive and protect each other. And one of them starts maybe thinking that he can see aspects of this different world. And we're questioning the entire time whether it's real or not, or what we would even consider real. And the portrayal of the love that they have for each other. And this was so healing. If you were ever a kid or a teenager who went through some shit and you were just doing the best that you could, which I mean, I have a feeling that's the majority of us, okay? I think that I wish that I had this book when I was in high school. Phenomenal. I don't even have like any notes, anything I would change. I sobbed. Number 4 is Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. This is not the only Olivia Blake book that is coming up. No, it is not. We're just saying a lot. I discovered Olivia Blake's writing with the Atlas 6. I gave that a 4-star, figured upon reread it would be a 5-star. Ended up reading the Atlas Paradox, which we'll talk about, okay? Spoiler alert. And now I just want to read everything that she's ever written ever. I love her writing. There's not a lot of plot. It is mainly vibes, characters, and some purple-y prose, but not in a try hard, in my opinion, kind of way. But you have to be okay with it just feeling like nothing is happening. And I love it. And I was shocked at this because the only things I had read up until that point of hers were fantasy. And this isn't fantasy, it's a love story. I actually thought it was fantasy. It's not. And it's following our two main love interests who they meet in a museum and they agree to have 6 conversations with each other. The number is important, but the number escapes me. And I cannot tell you how amazing of a representation this is of like what I feel like is realistic love. Like this is not a fluffy, lighthearted rom-com kind of book. This is dark and heavy, and they make decisions that you do not agree with, and they're a little bit pretentious, and I don't think that they're supposed to be super likable, but somehow you still love them and want the best for them and are rooting for them, and just, I felt so invested in these characters like I do with a lot of Olivia Blake's characters, and I can't wait to reread this book. I gave it to my mom because we ended up just reading things that I had highlighted over breakfast one day while I was in the middle of it, and I'm convinced that she's going to love it, and we don't often love the same books. So that's saying a lot. Number 3, I will say, all of these in this top like 6 at any point in time could be rearranged depending on, except for I would say my number 1. So keep that in mind. But currently right now, number 3 is Bunny by Mona Awad. I hinted to it. Okay, if you've seen the video, you probably knew that this was coming. This is fucking weird. I don't know what else to say about it, but it blew me away. I can't wait to reread it. I love it. It's a horror book that I feel like you're either gonna love or you're gonna hate, so you just have to go into it knowing that you're along for the ride and you've got to just figure out if it works for you or not. If you want to be reading a book and the entire time you just want to be saying to yourself, what the actual fuck is happening right now? Bunny by Mona Awad. Number 2, we have our final and top tier Olivia Blake book, The Atlas Paradox. Is this an unpopular opinion? I guess, because I was shocked to see that a lot of people who read The Atlas 6 and loved it didn't like The Atlas Paradox as much, but I loved this more than I loved The Atlas 6. The Atlas 6 is pitched as a book about 6 people who live in our world, but our world has magic. That seems to be a theme in the books I've been reading recently. But they are assigned to compete for a spot to protect the Library of Alexandria, which did not burn down, and it is actually magical and it holds a lot of magical secrets. Do we ever see the Library of Alexandria? No. Is this a competition book? No. Does anything happen? Not really. Are any of the characters likable? Only Gideon. But I still ended up loving them all at the end, so there's that. And now, number 1, this I feel firm about, and we've been leading to this. The 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. Oh my god. This is a little bit sci-fi, a lot of it fantasy, a little bit post-apocalyptic. I don't feel like I can tell you a lot about this book because for most of this book I didn't even know what was happening, but I was just loving every second of it. So let me see how this is pitched. I'll give you my pitch. If you love a high fantasy and you haven't read the series yet, what the fuck are you doing? Read the series. It says, this is the way the world ends. Again. This is told in multi-point of view. The main character that we start off with, San, is a mother, and she recently just figured out that her husband killed her son and has now kidnapped and taken away her daughter. And in this world, there is the 5th season that comes around every so often, which is basically just a whole new, like, kind of end of the world natural disaster that people have to figure out how to survive. And the entire, like, their entire society is built around surviving when these 5th seasons come around, and they're always something different. And we are on the precipice of this next 5th season. And no one knows how long it's going to last for, no one knows exactly what it's going to look like, they just know that they have to be prepared to somehow survive it. And we're also following this woman who is going through a lot of obvious heartbreak. There are certain people in this world who possess this magic that kind of connects them with the earth. And it's an interesting dynamic between the rest of civilization because society needs them, but they also fear them and therefore ostracize them and try to control them. I feel like no words that I say to try to explain this book to you is going to do it justice. So that is it. After 2 hours of me filming, hopefully I can cut this down a little bit. We have ranked all of the books that I have read so far in 2023. Let me know down in the comments below what are some of your favorites, your biggest hits, misses, anything we agree or disagree on. Leave me the emoji of a stack of books in the comments below if you made it all the way to the end of this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!